Gary Simpson is a man of God. He is the senior pastor of the Concord Baptist Church of Christ and has been since 1990. He is an associate professor of homiletics at Drew Theological Seminary. He has served as visiting professor of preaching, worship, and the arts at Union Theological Seminary and has taught at New Brunswick Theological School, Yale Divinity, Harvard Divinity School, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Candler School of Theology. At Concord Church, Simpson created a formal pastoral residency program in 2002 with the support of the Lilly Endowment. This program has aided a generation of seminary graduates as they transition to congregational ministry. In 2011, again with Lilly Endowment support, that program expanded to 3 more African American Baptist congregations. In January 2023, it was announced that the Progressive National Baptist Convention would use a $1 million grant from the Lilly Endowment to fund a 5-year training program for ministers of the historically Black denomination as they adapt their preaching in an age challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. Simpson will lead the planning. Now that we are at this stage in the pandemic's life with us, he says, we are all facing challenges of hybridity. And so the program will also examine questions like, what shape and form will our preaching take? How do we employ available technology? Are there emerging models of proclamation worth studying more diligently? I think you will agree with me that Reverend Dr. Simpson is a man who is committed to excellence. He is a writer, he is a seeker of the truth, and he is a truth teller. Would you please join me in welcoming Reverend Simpson.
Well, I am delighted to be here today. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for your presence here today. I am both honored and humbled by this invitation to address you, realizing that on this ground of Chautauqua, there have been many people who have across the years shared their hearts and minds with the nation and the world from these spaces. This is one of the places I dreamed about when I was a young seminarian at Union, and I'd read all the Christian Century magazines and see the announcement of the wonderful and thoughtful people who were coming in the summer. And I said, when I grow up, I'm going to go there. And I was here last year. My wife, Emma Jordan Simpson, is the president of Auburn Seminary, and she led the morning meditation. And I just sat in the audience and cheered her on. She would be here today, but she and our daughter, Candace, are the chaplains at the Haley Farm this week for the Children's Defense Fund as they are doing their work with freedom schools from around the nation. I am also happy that this invitation came from the African American Heritage House, whose mission it is to include the voices of the marginalized and excluded in the Chautauqua institution. That, dear friends, is a tiring prospect. I'm particularly grateful to the chair, Errol Davis, Dr. Sterling Freeman, Dr. Gordon, Cecilia Gordon, who has been gracious in this time, and to these interns who have made sure that every hospitality, Sydney and Melanie, thank you, has been extended to me. It is important to understand this as we start, that no matter how much or how many people want to argue for a homogeneous way of understanding American life. It is in fact, American life is in fact the gathering and attempted collaboration of all the uniquenesses that make us who we are. America and its democracy are ideas that we continue to live toward. We never really fully grasped them. When I was a young preacher, and I was a boy preacher, I'm surprised the Lord kept me this long. I remember growing up, Martin Luther King was our only role model. And I remember telling my classmates in college, well, I'm going to be dead by the time I'm 40. How woefully short-sighted and foolish that was. There are so many great things that have happened in my life since then. What a shame to short-circuit them on some messianic complex. I come to you in my 33rd year as the pastor of the Concord Baptist Church of Christ, founded in 1847. I am the 10th pastor in those 176 years. The first 5 pastors pastored for 15 years, and the last 5 of us have been 161 and counting. We are a church that started in the great struggles against slavery in 1847. The first pastor was an abolitionist, and he fought all along the eastern seaboard. He believed that making the African Christian or converting them to Christianity could be the way to save them from the treacheries of slavery. How wrong he was. But in that course, he was responsible for 50,000 baptisms of slaves and newly freed slaves along the eastern seaboard. Within its history and development of Concord, against all the things that have been happening in the backdrop in terms of race, in its history, there's the development of mutual aid societies and literary societies helping the newly released slaves, participation in the women's suffrage organizations, fights to have it legal for black people in Brooklyn to be property owners in 1847. They could not be. These core commitments have led to the organization later of the state's first chartered elementary school by an independent congregation in 1961, a senior service center program for home care attendants and their management, a community-based foster care program that held the city's highest adoption rate for years. And while these programs are a part of our history, we presently operate a CDF-inspired freedom school, a federal credit union, a seniors apartment residence, a 140-bed skilled nursing care facility, and an endowment set aside for worthy social causes, whose last gift as the pandemic was beginning was to make a gift to relieve $4.7 million of medical debt. We began, I called the people responsible. I said, okay, we want to buy all the medical debt in Brooklyn. And so at that time, there was only X amount done in Brooklyn. We finished that, and so you said, well, you have money left over, so now let's go to Essex County and Newark, New Jersey. And we, in that time, used the money from the Christ Fund to do that very thing, and that was one of our inspirations we kept coming back to during the pandemic. I address you also as a professor of preaching, homiletics, preaching, and pastoral formation at Drew Theological Seminary. My dean and the president of the university want me to do that. I want to say, though, I am not bivocational. I have one vocation. I am bilocational. And I am grateful to spend my life doing those things. I must admit that my present-day perspective was shaped by the loving memory of the Southfield Community Missionary Baptist Church in Columbus, Ohio, where I grew up. My father was my first pastor. I do not think, and this was the other reason to take this engagement, is that today is my father's birthday. Now, if he was alive, he would have been 94 and trying his best to get here. Unfortunately, he died 6 months before his 61st birthday. I have one brother, a physician, who died at 51. And at the age of 48, I was now the patriarch in my family. And now I stand before you older than both of them at their death days. It sucks. And being a black man in America is a health risk. My father was important to me because he was my first pastor in the 60s. There was a development that began in the southeast corner of Columbus, Ohio. Lockbourne Air Base was right there, and there retired military personnel will come and build their homes, and other working middle-class blacks would raise their families. My father was a tradesman, a mason by training, and after starting that church in a public school, the men of that church in their 20s and 30s built that first church edifice with their own hands. The church was built on 10 acres of land, and behind the parking lot at this time, which was not able to be asphalted, it was graveled. On the other side of that was a big piece of land that sat there where members of the church could go and claim whatever space they wanted to and grow vegetables there inside under the auspices of the church. Now that really bothered us, we who were children, because we were city kids. And our parents kept going out doing that farming stuff out there, and it kind of annoyed us. Mentioning my father is significant for one more reason pertaining to the topic I want to address today. I was with my father when I got introduced to that vow epitaph by a young white male and two girls. They pulled up next to us at a traffic light, giggling and laughing. We were in a VW minibus, 1968 it was, and they pulled up to us, next to us in a Beetle. I could smell the pot coming out of the window. I was less than 10 years old, and he stopped at the light and yelled into our car that word. My father, the guy sped off. Like many people who use those words, they run. He sped off, and my father gave chase to him and caught him at the next traffic light, rolled down his window, stuck his finger out, and said, "You're another one." That may not seem like much to you, but I was less than 10 years old. And from that point on, my father had separated that word from race. And it had made me aware that that word comes in all races, and I know for a fact that wherever I am, that he and his friends are somewhere lurking around, waiting on an opportunity to call me something that they are themselves. I had so many things to talk about today. I've been thinking about this. It is Chautauqua. You've got to bring your A game and all. And so I'd scribbled out a few things. I'm a part of a writers group of black scholars and pastors who are writing a history, as it were, about black pastoral leadership from the Civil War until the 90s. I've been working on a book inspired by one of my preaching heroes, Prathia Hall, entitled Freedom Spaces. I've been digging into planning theory and looking at complexity, chaos theory, and distributed intelligence as indicators for assessing sustainable communities. I went back to the program, and Cecilia Gordon and I had a passing conversation about logistics, and she said, well, you know, the theme for the week is the state of believing. It was a godsend. You saved me and all these people from those waxing on of things. I want to say also that when I got the copy of the Chautauqua Daily today, it was confirmed. It said Simpson to give a talk at the Hall of Philosophy. So I am disabused myself of having to do any preaching, any lecturing. I'm just going to talk. The state of believing should not be confused with the state of the church. So many people, because the church has been the purveyor and the one who has insisted that we believe, that somehow now with the church being in the chaotic space that it is, that believing also is floundering because the church is trying to stay alive. But may I say that there's so much believing, and I mean good, meaningful believing, happening outside the church, in other faiths, in other institutions, in communities where people are organized for justice and inclusion and fair housing and living wage preservation of the earth in these awfully intense days of climate change. There are people who believe that what is does not have to stay that way. In fact, there are some things done in this present day church that are actually unbelievable. Predictable, but unbelievable. Like one of our denominations who just excommunicated churches because they had women as pastors. Unbelievable. Predictable, given their history, and some of us recognize from whence they started and what the issue was then. Another conversation. We have to distinguish today believing from adherence to ideological loyalties. Partisanship is killing all the creativity that believing could ever be because we are so convinced that the world is still stuck in binaries. If you're not for us, you're against us. Suffice it to say, in that construct, people are believing more now than ever, and more passionately than ever, more dangerously now than ever. Belief is so prominent in public discourse to speak about things that would say believing is doing very well, but it does not matter whether or not we do believe. The most pertinent question is, what or who do we believe, and how can we be certain that our beliefs are not just our own living out of our selfishness and calling it belief? We cannot seem to separate in this nation what I believe from our propensities and romance with the wild, wild west mentality of American violence. We want to defend our beliefs, even with our guns. Many such actions of this ilk are indefensible. It's not that just churches that are overzealous, adherent to many, but adherents of many faith followers who have literal interpretations of the text they consider sacred. All over the world now, there are challenges and potential wars and flashpoints based on faith fundamentalists of many persuasions. Everybody is adhering to what their texts say, and anyone who does not is an infidel. To be sure, fundamentalists are not just centered in the faith at all, but there are those who also have a fundamentalist approach to the sacred text of their public life, like the Constitution. The Civil War's decision, trying to cast this decision in the light of individual and personal rights, led one justice to call the Constitution's quote-unquote colorblind. Such a statement is a denial of who was in the room when the Constitution was written. I also know, in this sense, for some reason, we assign some kind of sacredness to the people who have gone before us as if they are not fallible in the same ways that we are. It's important for us to understand that all of life is about interpretation. When you leave here today, somebody might ask you, what did that guy talk about? And you'll tell them what I talked about, and this is what he said. And in most instances, it might be what I said, but it might not have been what I meant. Well, I also want to be sure that I am not standing here as the representative of the black church. I think assumptions are made about black religious life, A, that all black people are in churches, and then B, that all black churches are the same. I wish I could say that we were. I would feel better if they were all the same for the same things, but there are also some things about the black church that also need, and churches that need critiquing. But I am helped and I am reminded by my church history professor, James Washington, who taught me that the best definition of a church is a local congregation. It is about the building of communities. It is about beyond its liturgies and creeds and credos and songs and sermons and prayer rituals and services for this and that, its ordinances and its building. Church is about community and about the building of community. I know that some of us are tired of talking about it. We really wish that we could just wipe COVID-19 out of our memories. I want to say that might be a reaction of having been traumatized. And in fact, when we are talking now about church and churching and belief and believing, we have to be aware that life in these spaces and places, institutions, or whatever movements, whatever we're going to call them, have been profoundly changed by those last 3 years. First of all, we have become intimately aware that we have but one world. And the fact is that in every place where people gathered in any kind of social arrangement, if they're all across the world, everywhere, there was this kind of, I don't want to call it a democratization of the virus because that's too strong a word, because the other reality is that we also noticed in many places, like in America, like in Brooklyn, New York, and Queens, that there was a vast difference between the people who were dying from COVID, who happened to be brown and black and poor, and the people who had the access to all of the things that would make them unaware, including escape to other places. Our friends in Hawaii got tired of folks coming there from the mainland. They said, don't come over anymore. Think about who could make that decision to just go hang out in Hawaii for a little while. Well, the truth is, in terms of church life, there is no church in America that is now what it was before the pandemic. In some way, we have all been affected. I have watched colleagues quit. I have watched churches fold. I have watched people gather new steam, and that's not all been bad. People have found out one of the good things that this did was that it took us away. The COVID did something that all our preaching, singing, and everything could not do, and that was it put our faith in our homes. Some of my good members would come to church all day on Sunday, and they go home and be terrors to the people who didn't go to church. You all understand what I'm saying. I think it's important for us to understand that in this time, we have also, we cannot forget that this COVID time also did not rescue us from the realities of racial differentiation and trouble as we saw in the George Floyd incident. In a culture that centers on and privileges whiteness, marginalized and minoritized communities have to spend their time explaining themselves and their stories, advocating for difference and diverse experiences. My good friend, Dr. Kenneth Ngwa, says in a book on, he's a Hebrew Bible scholar, in a book on the Exodus, he says that the empire has three ways of dealing with marginalized and minoritized communities. One is to just destroy them violently. Two is to act like they're not there, to ignore them completely. You know, like I get sometimes when I walk down the street and everybody sees that I'm the only black man there, and the people who speak to me are really asking me, what are you doing here? Not in Chautauqua, though, but in other places where I've been, where I've ended up being there by myself, and people have walked right by me. So I speak to everybody. I will be seen. I will not make a scene, but I will be seen. I'm thinking now of what Langston Hughes would say, I too sing America. When company came, they always put me in the kitchen to eat. The third thing that empire does is that it exceptionalizes. It says to minorities, some minorities, you know, you're not like the other ones. You know, it brings them into, I wish I had time to unpack this, that it brings them into that myth of American exceptionalism. That we are somehow a city that sits on a hill, a candle that cannot be put out, and that it places that, it imposes that identity of exceptionalism to say the reason why you're special is because you're not like everybody else, which really translates as we have you because you are like us. Well, I think I want to say that as we talk through this idea of believing and the state of believing, all these things I'm mentioning are parts of reacting to that we are not free to just believe and believe only. For me, this idea of sustainable communities is an important one. It is important to recognize that the purpose of faith communities is to have the opportunity, yes, for people to share their beliefs, but for communities to grow, not in a way that it becomes a singleness of likeness, but it grows in its own sense of diversity to include people larger and larger as the table gets expanded, for new communities that come into the realities, into the spaces, for whom we have to make room at the table. So in the pandemic, I had some time to sit around and think. I'll be honest with you, I am a different person after that time. But I didn't want to think by myself. I was isolated and confined, and so I dug into and started digging into some of the sermons and the talks and the conversations of some of the people who had gone before me. I spent a great portion of last summer researching and transcribing handwritten sermons from 3 of my predecessors. The one with the shortest pastorate, Leonard Black, who pastored from 1850 to 1852. Some scholars think the reason why he left the church was because the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted and that he had to go running for his life. The longest pastorate, William T. Dixon, and the educated pastor who was the predecessor to my predecessor, Gardner Taylor, James B. Adams. I've always been drawn to that person who represented the prototype for us. 46 years he was the pastor. I spent a few years digging in his life and work. He was a native of Virginia, an educator by trade. He grew up in Abyssinian Church in New York, First Black Baptist Church in New York City. He pastored Concord for 46 years. What was fascinating was not only his endurance, but the period of his 46 years was from 1863 to 1909. So he took them he comes right in after the Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case of 1857. During his time, the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Plessy versus Ferguson decision was made by the Supreme Court saying all things were that they could be separate but equal, but in reality practiced as separate and unequal. All of these days, this time, 1863, 1865, and after 1865 began the most exciting possible time of potential for blacks in America. The Reconstruction happened, and as that Reconstruction happened, more elected officials at every level were in places of government. There were economic places, the Black Wall Streets growing all over the place. And as a result of that, the reactionary, violent works of reprehensible vigilantes started. Dixon was the pastor during all this time, and he was very clear that in order for the church to be sustained, that he was going to have to create a space where it was not just driven by the pastor himself. It was not just going to be a thing for the community, for the church itself to get better and come out from it beyond them. In this struggle, then, in feeding from that as a hero of this time, there was no other way to characterize the life of Black religious people and other faith people in this community, race, African American. Some of you may want to use, we can talk about that if you want to in the question and answer. But there's no other way to describe the plight. There is no single silver bullet that can solve the matter of race. It takes a multi-pronged approach to do as many things as possible to distribute the intelligence among peoples who have expertise to do that. We must be reminded that the faith and believing is lived and centered in the people who have no voice for themselves. The Bible is clear about widows and orphans, the sick, the battered, the bruised, the tired, the overwhelmed. Let me leave you with some what next. We've got to solve this challenge of intergenerational or multi-generational, which is what we are. We are a number of generations existing in the same place, but we have to create the identity or the dynamic of intergenerationality. How do we get folks that we have boxed in these particular boxes of their generation? How do we get us to think intergenerationally about the work that needs to be done? We have to get beyond this idea that belief is an individual thing and that somehow we can be good believers and poor community participants. We have to get beyond this idea of right or wrong, which is too often translated in 2023 not as right or wrong, but right or left. We have to think about ways to be radically inclusive and that no one is left behind or left out. Dear friends, believing does one of two things. It either confines, conforms, and shapes you by an adherence to doctrines and mores, and judges you by the correctness of how many of those things you can check off as being a good person. Or belief frees you to participate in the larger freedom project of the community. The ultimate vision of the Revelation, where we read, "And I saw a number that no one can count, persons of every kindred, every tongue, every tribe, every kind, every nation." The things of race were not a part of that construct at that time. But I think that is the vision that we all should be working towards, so that we all have an opportunity to share in the beauties of humanity. So the next time you and I are at a table of fellowship or transformation, look around and see who in the human family is not there. And if you see sameness all around you, say to yourself, "I believe I have some work to do." Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Simpson. It's interesting that being black in the United States of America is a health risk, and yet we continue to build, as you just described. Please ask your questions by typing in questions.chq.org. Or if you need a piece of paper, raise your hand and we will do that as well. Before we begin with that, I did not acknowledge my wonderful chair, Errol Davis, and I would like him to please raise his hand or stand up or something. How many of you do not know who Mr. Davis is? You need to meet him, okay? You need to know Dr. Davis and his lovely wife, Elaine Davis. Yes. So, while I'm getting the questions, I've got one. Reverend, could you please talk a little bit more, if you could, about what it means to be radically inclusive?
I guess I can't help being who I am, and that is a preacher and a biblical scholar in some ways. So I am reminded that when God said, "Let us make humanity in our image," both male and female were created, which suggests to me not just the binary, but it also suggests to me that somehow the essence of God may be seen in how those things in the spectrum are connected. God is not, this may bother some of you, God is not, although the Bible does call God Father, some will argue that, but this sense of sexuality is a part of understanding radical inclusion. People are marginalized for many reasons. Gender is one, race is one, economics is one, identity is another. And radical inclusion is really an acceptance of the way life is. It always bothered me, even from a college student, that we were talking about diversity as a thing. The world is diverse. It's not a new phenomenon. Look around. The reality is that that radical inclusion says we are not going to. Everybody has a voice. Everybody has a story. Everybody is valued, and everybody is loved by God, and so by the people of God.
Thank you. Here's a question. What are themes you hear from your students? What matters most to them as they pursue religious leadership?
Interesting. I'm going to be very frank with you.
Okay.
The largest concern is, when I finish this degree, am I going to have a job? And I don't think it's economic selfishness. I think it's the reality of the vulnerability of churches at this point to be able to sustain themselves. I'm watching churches make decisions about leadership and moving from full-time leadership. I tell my friends in Brooklyn that those of us who are full-time in the pastorate, we probably are the last of those. That's going to fade away. I think the reality is, a few years ago, they reported that being in ministry was no longer a viable way of entering into the possibilities of the middle class. So, and this is one of the things we got to deal with. The church is no longer a viable place to think. The local congregation is no longer, and denominations with all the things that they are doing at this point, are no longer places for people to think about, I can build a career. And those are the questions that we get. And so people are exploring, and again, I think this is also a COVID thing in some ways. It intensified there, other opportunities to give pastoral identity into the world.
Thank you. Is there a trend in community to celebrate our failures and to acknowledge our blind spots, to be curious enough to ask, what next?
This is why you need the children. Their understandings of success are very different from ours. They tip us in ways that we would not want to think about. And while we are busy in the church trying to form belief for children and make them into what we thought was the right thing to do, many of them are saying, I don't want to do that, but I still believe. It's very interesting. I think that's one of the mistakes people make when they see young people who are activists, like in the Black Lives Matter movement. There were people who were assuming that those folks who were in that work were not people of spirituality and faith. They were deeply faithful. They just got tired of church.
When beliefs are often so strong, how do you convince people to become inclusive if they think it is oppositional to their beliefs? For example, acceptance of LGBTQ+.
Yeah. Well, I really lean into experience. I don't devalue our understanding of the Bible. You know, I teach at a Methodist school, so the Wesleyan quadrilateral is in my head right now. You know, scripture, reason, experience, revelation, right? None of those things is more important than the other. I think we all will feel differently, although I do know people who are so ardent about their beliefs on this. I have to tell a story. That's the only way I can get to it. So I went to do a Bible study at the Covenant House, which is a house for runaway children in Times Square. And I spoke with them between 15 and 22, and I kept hearing the same thing. All their stories, most of their stories began like this. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents said if I was going to be like this, then I couldn't stay in this house. And I'm saying to myself, experience and practically, what kind of religion would you have that you would throw your own blood out? You would rather be approved by folks who are going to talk about you as soon as you turn your back, or are you going to provide the kind of nurture that is needed for your generational continuance? I don't get it. I don't understand that. And I think that's part of the problem. Believing is not about how right I am. The opportunity we have to share beliefs. How many of you have been in, if you're a worshiping, practicing person in some way, how many of you have been to another faith community's work to their worship service. Or somebody who doesn't speak your language. It's an amazing thing of what happens when you're taking out your own familiar and you're in places. It's interesting how you really start to resonate with some things that are central core, perhaps even primordial to us as a people, about our longing to be in fellowship and community. So,
Dr. King famously said that the most segregated hour in the week was 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. That doesn't seem to have changed to any degree. Do you have any comments?
You know, I love that quote for a very special reason. It has been reported that Martin Luther King said that. He actually got it from my predecessor, Gardner Taylor. Gardner, and you could check this out in the World Baptist Alliance in 1958, that was in Cleveland. Dr. Taylor makes this statement about 11 o'clock being the most segregated hour. I think the thing that, so that way I just like that because it gives me a chance to talk about the greatest preacher since Paul and Jesus. But I think we have to be honest about that church is also a function of culture. Now, the problem is when we start to worship the culture and it moves into the place of being our penultimate concern or whatever, our mighty, the thing that gives us definition of ourselves. We have to be careful that we are not worshiping in our own image. I'm thinking now historically about African American churches in the turn of the 20th century. Many of immigrant African American people who came into the country went to those African American churches to learn the American culture and be freed of the unnecessary burden of racism in church. Now those communities are starting their own faith communities. The largest growing church in Brooklyn for many years has been a French-speaking Haitian Baptist church. And there are reasons for people to be together. So I don't want to. I think that was a dramatic statement. I think there are reasons why people fellowship in community. I think what I would want to say is that I would hope that as we gather, it is not a goal of every church to have 11.5% black people in the church. It's not a goal. But I do think we should have an understanding that all people are welcome. Here's a curious thing. My church is in the center of Bedford-Stuyvesant, center of African American identity for many years. It's changing now with gentrification exponentially. But I always get people when I talk from where I am, people say, I'd love to come to your church. Would I be welcome? Oh. My church is 98.6% black. Notice the presupposition, and I used to get offended by that. Then I started to think that maybe they're telling me about their church. Because I have been to some of my friends' churches, and my family and I, wherever we're on vacation, we go to church. We don't care. We go somewhere, we go to church. We came into a church, I won't say where it was, and we filled up a pew. There was a man standing at the door the whole day who was just beside himself that there was a pew full of those people in his space.
Please discuss your views and thoughts about the ability for biological systems coexisting with quantitative systems such as generative AI.
Oh,
artificial.
Go on with yourself.
I don't know.
How did you begin that?
I don't know.
You said something about, tell me what I believe about
discuss your
that?
views and thoughts about
my views and thoughts. Oh, that's an easy one. Mm-hmm. I have not thought about it.
Okay, thank you. Here's one that you may have. You've already answered it with two people, but in addition to Dr. King and your predecessor, who are the other scholars and artists and practitioners who inspire you?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Because I struggled with this today, even in talking about my predecessors, because we also have to concede that that black religious leadership as practiced in America has been a very patriarchal thing. And I want to say from the utmost, from the jump start, that I think that all of us have to have some people who are not identified with us directly as a part of our pantheon of people we believe in. So there are a lot of women in there: Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker. There are, my mom. I talked about my dad, but I didn't tell you about my mom. You'd have to. That's a whole nother hour. And I'm glad you mentioned artists, because this is one of the reasons why I like the African American House and its kind of commitment to an interdisciplinary approach. No one community is going to solve this. That's why building up community is important. We need people with different skill sets, different expertise, different artistic abilities. The people who think it are not just going to be the people who do it. The people who think deeply about their creativeness. Notice how I said that because people who are creative do think. They just think differently. Some people can tell you with theories, other people can paint it for you, can dance it for you. You need all of that to make a whole community. I think, the more and more I think about it, Paul's understanding of the church as the body of Christ is probably one of the most lasting metaphors, because you are one person in a body, but every part of your body counts. Mm. And the things that we spend all our time in making beautiful are the things that don't matter. It's the stuff it's the ugly parts on the inside of us that really matter. So I think it's this idea of just of acknowledging everybody is a teacher. That's what I want to say.
What are the bright spots you are seeing in American religion? Who is doing the work that is exciting or provocative to you?
I think right now we're all very busy. I don't think that those things have evolved right now, because we are not reclaiming churches. We are planting churches right now. We are starting from scratch, even though we have assets of buildings and those kind of things. Every church community is doing things, and the people who are thinking about what those exciting things look like are the people who are not being so building-centric that they're not in the community. Church people have to be out in the community.
Which takes us to this question. How do we get our young families to join our churches?
We have to be willing to confess that we've been wrong about a lot of things. Young people are not in a place now where they, this is for better or for worse, that they believe they bring something to the table. We don't always think that they have gotten to the age where they can bring anything. And I think we've got to learn how to be more open. I'll be honest, my best teachers today are my children. They just show me stuff that I never would have thought about. And it informs me on all these things, including some of the things we've talked about today. I have been more impacted by my children because I want the world to be a place where they can thrive and be who they really are.
We seem to be fear-driven as a society these days. What are the top 3 you are seeing?
Top 3 fears?
Fears.
Oh. I think xenophobia is the answer. We're afraid of everything and everybody. We other people so quickly. And I think the fear of the other, the fear of the unknown. I think some of us are afraid that we might just have run this whole creation into the ground, and we're about to all experience the death of this earth as we know it. talk with somebody, a Gen Xer, they'll tell you, we're all going to be dead in 5 years. The fatalism that happens after watching that the future is not guaranteed. That's why we have to be about not only just a hopefulness for a future, but acting for the future that we want to see.
If you could wave a magic wand, what would Chautauqua create space for that it doesn't right now?
Oh, I am not an expert on Chautauqua. I can tell you my experience in Chautauqua. I've been here a couple of times, and I know that there is a great interest in people, by some people in this community, to want to diversify, particularly to have more African Americans, people of color, participate in the things more year-round. I think one of the things that people have to understand is that when I'm talking for me now, not talking for anybody else, I'm representing me. When I come into this space, I come into a space that is not my normal space. And so things that you might consider to be the things to do may not be the things that I would do. And it's not that I don't like you. It's not that I don't like those things. That's just not what I do. And to have some spaces where people can just, what really should happen in many of these places is just get a big table and have everybody bring the food from their culture and not have any conversations about anything about except how good that food is. Yeah, that's what I think. That's the beginning. The beginning of all this is about relationships. And we're so busy trying to turn, somebody said something about we're addicted to information, and we've turned everything into data. You are not a data point. I'm not a data point. We are human beings. And we need the engagement of each other just on our own sake. So I'm not what you think I should be, but so what? I mean, none of us are. You don't believe me. You don't think God has a sense of humor. Get up tomorrow morning, look in the mirror. And you'll see, every one of us will see how imperfect we are. One shoulder's, just naturally, one shoulder's longer, one foot's longer than the other. I won't go into other parts of the anatomy, just things are different on us. And if we can accept that about ourselves, then we can accept that about other people. And let's just sit down and talk, not lecture, not preach. One more thing and I'm done on this. If we learn to sing together, we'll solve a lot of problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua institutions' full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.